Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatore. So you find yourself down the end of my garden again in a different corner perhaps than you've seen before, and behind me I have a sacrificial holly tree that I don't want to be there. So we're going to look today at some very simple basic advice for sharpening a machete. Now you will notice this is, you might be wondering which is the front edge on this. The front edge is the inside edge, okay, so that's the sharp edge on this. You do get similar so-called panga knives to this. You can tell which one's the front instantly by the shape of the handle. This is obviously the front, but sometimes you do get them that way around as well, and the sharp edge is this side. In fact, I used to have one, and for some stupid reason I sold that. Probably shouldn't have done. But this is an old one. The question is how old? Don't know. I would say it's at least kind of Second World War or earlier than that. It could be 19th century. The fact is that these were made for trade, mostly to Africa and South America, places where you get lots of jungle, even India. And these were made for trade in places like Birmingham and Sheffield, and sold out of the country, exported or traded in return for other things. So this is an old one I picked up for very little money years and years and years ago. I think actually from, if I remember correctly, from a friend of mine who had it lying around, and I purchased it. I can't see a maker's name on it, but if I clean it up, which I probably will do at some point, there might be one on there. Now, this is sharp enough to deal with a lot of foliage and brush, and the fact is that you don't need to make a lot of tools, as you'll know probably from garden clearance and garden management. You'll know you don't need to make them super sharp in order to cut stuff. Something like a lawnmower, for example, the blades in a lawnmower are usually not even sharp at all, but there are some advantages. There's also some disadvantages, which I'll come to in a second. There are some advantages to having a sharp machete. For a start, it makes your job easier, assuming that your job is clearing medium level brush. If you want to chop down small saplings and really thick wood, then to be honest, you want something that's going to cut a little bit more like an axe, so you don't need a very fine edge. You almost want a sort of wedge edge or chisel edge. For this, I want something partly for fun, essentially, that's pretty sharp, but I'm not going to go to huge pains to make it super sharp, like shaving sharp or anything like that, but I want something that makes my job a little bit easier. At the same time, this is reasonable quality spring steel, okay, you can see that, and you'll notice if you go to a modern hardware store and buy a machete, generally speaking, they're made in parts of the world where quality is not considered that important anymore, unfortunately. And most machetes that you buy, certainly in the UK, and from what I understand from the internet, this is true of America as well, most of them are very poor quality steel, not much above mild steel, or they're very low carbon spring steel, and they don't keep an edge very well. I have sharpened this before, but it doesn't have a great edge on it. So I'm just going to go through 3 simple methods or tools that you can use to sharpen up something like this. Just before I do, I'm just going to mention, obviously, for sharpening something like a sword or a knife or bayonet or anything like that, the considerations are slightly different. You might be looking at slightly different edge geometry, and you might be a lot more careful about doing it. So this is a garden tool. You can see it's not in the best condition. It's got some dents and nicks and a little bit of a bend at the back here where someone's been hitting it with something they shouldn't have been. So I'm not that bothered about it. Right. The 3 things that you can sharpen an object with, and these can be applied to knives and swords, okay, but the way that you do it might change slightly depending what the thing is you're sharpening. First up, and some people don't think about this when they talk about sharpening, but it's actually one of the most important tools, especially if you're starting off with something which is completely blunt. In other words, just a flat piece of steel. For example, if you want to sharpen something that's maybe like a steel ruler, meter rule made of steel, or if you want to sharpen, if you're making, for example, a knife or even a sword, and you haven't yet got to an edge, then a file, okay, a simple file that's suitable for filing steel rather than wood, for example, because you do get some woods, rasps and stuff that are better suited to softer materials, but you get one that's good for steel. And this is an incredibly useful tool. Now, a lot of people would think of that as something that you make or form a blade with, not necessarily something that you sharpen it with, but you can sharpen a blade to functionally sharp It'll be quite a toothy edge, but a lot of us, myself included, like toothy edges. You can sharpen something up to a functional toothy edge with a file. And actually, if we want to talk about historical martial arts and historical treatises, for example, if we look at Alfred Hutton's The Swordsman from 1867, he actually talks about a lot of things in The Swordsman of 1867 that he never talks about in later sources, or earlier sources in fact. He only talks about them there. He talks about, for example, the use of the yataghan bayonet, which is quite unique in British sources, but he also talks about how cavalry trooper should sharpen up his sabre, his cavalry sabre, his service sabre, and he talks about cavalry troopers being issued with or keeping a file to do that. And Hutton, like me, is a fan of a toothy edge. Now, some people in the modern knife making world don't like toothy edges because they think that they become blunt more quickly because the teeth get curled over or broken off in use, and there's a degree of truth to this. But if you're willing to sharpen your object every day and keep it maintained, a toothy edge is actually very good at getting through certain materials, including one of them being clothing. And I have found in test cutting with swords that toothy edges, generally speaking, perform better, so long as they're freshly sharpened, perform better than a really fine, smooth edge, as it were, kind of razor edge. Right, so that's the first tool. Let's look at the second one. So this is another one a lot of people don't think about as a sharpening implement, but you absolutely can sharpen things with: sandpaper. Okay, so a lot of people talk about whetstones and sharpening stones, but they forget that all they are is an abrasive. Okay, all a stone is, whatever kind of, whether it's a really fancy Japanese whetstone or whether it's a DC4 ceramic stone like I use, the Falcon-Even DC4, which is my favourite, or any other type of whetstone, even the cheap whetstones you get from the hardware store for sharpening axes and stuff. Any of those whetstones are simply an abrasive. A stone is just an abrasive. And what is on sandpaper? It's sand, which is a type of, obviously it's silicon, it's a type of very fine stone. Okay, so actually you're not really doing anything really different when you're sanding something to when you're sharpening something. They're both forms of abrasion or polishing. It's all the same thing. It's just on a gradient. It's just a different scale. And obviously sandpaper comes in different grits and different types of paper, different types of sand, essentially. Now what I've got here is something akin to a wet and dry sandpaper. Okay, so this is essentially wet and dry sandpaper in a block. This is a spongy block, which I have to say is probably not best for sharpening. Well, for sharpening you really want a hard block, be it cork or wood or whatever, or simply wet and dry sandpaper glued onto a piece of wood. And I do know people who sharpen things exceptionally well just simply by buying some wet and dry sandpaper in whatever grit you want to use, cutting a strip of it and gluing it onto a piece of wood. And you can sharpen something, I would say, pretty much as well as you can with a whetstone with a bit of wet and dry sandpaper glued onto a piece of wood. You don't have to go out and buy expensive whetstones. Technically, you might be able to get a slightly better edge if you're really at the top level of sharpening skill. You might be able to get a slightly better edge with an actual whetstone with water. But really, when we're talking about sharpening things for test cutting in the garden or machete for chopping down a holly tree, this is going to be more than sufficient. Okay, this is better than actually a cheap whetstone. So this will give you a better edge than a cheap whetstone will. And finally, the last one is the aforementioned DC4 Falcon-Even knife sharpening stone. I love these. They give a really good edge. They're really well made. I've got two of these actually. I have like an indoors one and an outdoors one. You can put them in your pocket, you can carry them anywhere. I have one in my toolkit and I have one which I might take out and about with me. So for bushcraft, but equally if you've got a cutting party, if you slip this in your pocket, great thing to have around. Right, so let's have a little look at sharpening this machete. So here we've got our machete, and really what I'm saying in regards to this applies to any edged implement. Simply if you're dealing with something like an Albion sword, a high-end sword, or if you're talking about a Bowie knife or an antique or whatever else, you will adjust these methods accordingly because you might want to be a lot more careful with the object you're you're sharpening. Okay, right, the first thing is you need to pick an edge bevel. Okay, so my advice, if you're putting a bevel on something or establishing, shall we say, resharpening an existing bevel, you need to pick the bevel that you want for that edge, that is the edge angle, and stick to it. What you absolutely don't want to do, if we just use the file for a second, so you want to say that's the angle, you want to be sharpening corresponding to that angle the whole time and keep it flat and the same. So your angle between this and this wants to remain consistent. What you absolutely don't want to do is find yourself rolling at all as you're sharpening. If you roll this way, you will muck up the flat of the blade here and essentially apple seed the edge, which is not a disaster, but it will spoil the look of your edge. It will make your edge look messy and amateurish, and if you're dealing with a nice quality sword, you will mess up the polish of the flat of the blade, and like I say, it will make the edge look messy and irregular. So that's if you come too close, if you're letting it bend that way when you're sharpening. If you let it come to sort of acutely across the front of the edge, what you're going to do is you're going to remove the edge. So you literally, if you want to blunt a blade, all you have to do is do the same thing as you would when you're sharpening, but do it across the edge, okay? And if you let the angle roll that way at all, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be rolling the front of that edge over, so you're essentially stripping that fine edge off the front of your blade. So what you want to do is establish your blade on something. It's quite useful to use a stool or a table or a bench or even a tree or the ground. You can sit on the ground and do this. For the purposes of this video, just so you can see, I'm going to use my knee, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend, and obviously if it's a pointed implement you can't do that because you stab yourself in the knee. You pick your edge bevel, okay, which for me is there, so I'm establishing or reinforcing the edge bevel that's there, and then simply you're going to file down like that, so that you are, like I say, re-establishing or polishing or fine-tuning that bevel that you've actually already got on the implement. Okay, now I've already got a bevel on this, so I'm not going to show doing that very much because I don't need to. I will say that off camera what I will do is I need to do a bit more work on establishing the bevel up here because it's not as well established as it is down here. Okay, now you can just leave it at that, and that will be an adequate edge for chopping through foliage, but it might not be a fantastic edge, and you might want to polish it a bit further and make it a finer edge, in which case you go to either the stone or the sandpaper. Now I'm going to show the sandpaper because I've probably going to show the stone more in future videos, but essentially all you're doing at that point is doing this of polishing the bevel and doing the same thing as with the file. You're going to be, so you can set the pommel or butt against your chest and pick your angle, so you can, if that's 90 degrees, you can come off that to whatever angle you want to do, and then you can literally just polish up like that, so you are fine polishing that edge. And you can do ones, you can spend quite some time, maybe let's say 5 or 10 minutes on one side on the area that you want to do. You don't have to do it all in one clean sweep, you can do little sections, and a lot of people when they're talking about doing knives where the whetstone is on the table or counter or whatever, worktop, and they will do all of the blade in one clean sweep like this. You can't physically really do that with swords most of the time. Number one, because you don't have a whetstone long enough to do the whole blade in one sweep, and number two, because often you can't do the length of the blade in one clean sweep. It's just not really practical, so we swap things around with longer blades whereby you hold the blade stationary and you move the polishing or sharpening or grinding material. So here we're just polishing that edge, and the whole time being sensitive in both hands. You can move both so long as both move relative to each other, and so that you're constantly not rounding that edge, okay? And you can do that for ages and you will end up with a really fine edge on here. Now when you've done that for a certain amount of time, you can of course flip it around, being careful with any points and anything else, and you do the same thing on the other side like this. And what you're doing there is, if you imagine, I'm going to use my hands here, so if you imagine your edge bevel is here, when you're polishing just one plane here, what happens is you essentially end up polishing this very fine on one side, and what you can end up with is what's sometimes known as a wire edge, or what I've seen referred to as a wire edge, but it's essentially the material here can start to become very, very thin at the edge, and because you're pushing only and polishing only from one direction, it will start to essentially roll over or lip over the other side. Such that, imagine if I'd only been polishing one side, if you take your fingernail, it will seem smooth on one side, but when you do that on the other side, it will run up to the edge and your fingernail will just catch slightly underneath that slightly curled over edge. So you'll have a fine edge, but it's no longer pointing in the middle, it's now rolling over slightly to the side. So what you're doing when you polish the other side is essentially taking that, you're taking this bit off so that you end up with a really fine edge in the center axis of the blade again. Okay, now you could of course do exactly the same thing with any face of one of these. I've just got some grass stuck on it, with either face of the DC4 stone or any other type of whetstone. Okay, so it's the same thing, but there is a difference. Notice that with the pad I was going in the direction of the cutting edge. Okay, so I wasn't going into the edge, I was going away from the edge, and that is of course what we do when we're doing a leather strop. Don't worry about leather strops for now, that's just another form of abrasion, it's just another form of polishing, but it's like finer, even finer than sandpaper, even finer than polishing, than stones, whetstones. But the reason I'm going away from it here is because of the nature of what I'm using. This pad is quite soft and squishy, and the danger if I go into the edge with this is that it will lap around as I push into, the material will squish slightly and push into and blunten the edge. When I'm using a stone doesn't squish, it's stone, it's hard, it's ceramic, and so when I'm using this I prefer to use the gold face, incidentally, the ceramic face, rather than the grey stone one. I go into the stone like this. Now this does give a more bitey edge, a more defined edge, because there's no movement in the stone. If you use sandpaper on wood, then you can use it a little bit like a stone, okay, because it is harder and it's not squishy like the pad was. So always, whatever material you're using to sharpen or to polish or hone, you're going to have to be sensitive to the properties of that thing and decide at what point you want to change your tactics for how you attack this blade. You can sharpen that way going into the blade, which is good and generally advised. You can do it the other way as well, and it will achieve similar results, although some people would argue not quite as good with this particular material. The most important thing in all of this, whatever abrasion you're using, whatever technique you're using, is keeping the edge angle consistent and not changing and rolling. Okay, you've absolutely got to keep that fixed, and that's why when we look at machines like I think it's Worksharp, I've owned one but barely used it because I find it overheats the blades and ruins the temper. If you're using a machine, or if you're using one of these Lanxey type things with rods, it's all about, all of those machines, and whether we're using a belt sander or even a belt grinder, all of those things are about maintaining a consistent edge angle. Okay, and the machines, for a large part, they're cutting out the amount of elbow grease, the amount of effort you have to put into it, but what they're also doing is forcing you to have a very consistent and precise edge angle that doesn't vary at any point during the sharpening process. Okay, but you can do that by hand and eye, probably not as reliably as a machine, but I really like using hand and eye for a number of reasons. Okay, that's pretty sharp already actually. I like doing it, and I'm just briefly showing what's required here. You bear in mind, to sharpen a blade properly, especially if you start off with it being blunt, can take quite a long time. So be patient, take your time. It's not going to instantly become sharp like in a movie by scratching it a few times on a stone. Okay, it might take half an hour, it might take an hour, it might take a whole evening. It depends entirely on the edge geometry, the edge angle, the type of blade that you're working on, the materials that you're using, all sorts of things. So be prepared for it to take as long as it takes, but you will get quicker the more practiced you get. But yeah, so basically, there are many ways to skin a cat. There are many ways to sharpen a blade. Some people prefer one, some people prefer another. My personal preference for using hand implements like these over belt sanders or the work sharp that I do own, or kind of other rigs, Lanxey type things with ceramic rods, is personally I like the idea of being able to sharpen a blade anywhere, anytime. Okay, so if I can pick up some sandpaper and sharpen a blade, if I can use a ceramic tile or the bottom of a plate and sharpen a blade, that's a good thing. It's a useful skill to have, especially if you go camping or hunting or whatever, and you know how to sharpen your own knives in the field with a DC4 stone or whatever else you have available. But equally, there's another thing which people often don't talk about, and that is high quality swords and knives, antiques or modern. They are heat treated to very specific tolerances. Now, it's very easy, well, relatively easy with machines anyway, to mess with the hardness, in other words, the quenched hardness and the temper of blades when you get to the edge, because you're dealing with a very thin amount of material, and it's very quick and easy to overheat thin edges when you're sharpening, grinding, polishing, anything that involves friction, because friction produces heat. Okay, and I have seen blades that have been repolished that the polishing has been done so brutally with such a high powered polishing wheel for so long, we're talking about like an hour pushed against a felt polishing buffing wheel, it has completely removed or completely ruined the heat treatment of the blade. Not to say it's completely soft, but it has removed the springiness of the blade and discoloured the blade as well, because of course when you heat a blade it changes the colour of it slightly as well, and it can change the hue of the steel. Obviously you don't want to do this with an antique, but equally you don't want to do it with your expensive Albion sword or any other custom sword that you've spent a lot of money on ordering, and the smith has put a huge amount of experience and money into making and heat treating for you. You don't want to mess with that. And one of the reasons I don't like belt sanders is I see people putting high quality hardened steel blades against grinders. And think about what the heat is happening. Think about the heat that's happening at the edge. Now, historically, when people used grinding wheels, they used a water trough. So the grinding wheel was constantly going through a water trough and pulling cold water over that blade, and probably they'd only go grind for a little bit and then they would quench the thing. Okay, so they were concerned about that simply with hand driven or water driven grinding wheels. When we're talking about electric driven ones, or even petrol driven ones, machines, then it's very easy to overheat that edge. So for many reasons I prefer hand tools. So that's a very brief view at of how to sharpen something like this or anything else. I'm going to carry on with a little bit of work on this, and then we're going to take down that holly bush. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.